If you saw a dog drowning beneath a frozen river, would you jump in, even if your heart was already broken? That morning, the snow was falling in heavy, wet clumps outside Bend, Oregon, and Maggie Lowell was walking the river path alone, just like she had for the past 147 days. That was the exact number of mornings since her husband Jim had died of a heart attack while tying his fishing flies in their garage. Their home had been sold, her things packed into a trailer, and her days had become quiet, cold repetitions. The only place that still felt like him was the river, the day chute, where they used to sit for hours, saying nothing, just watching the current move. She wore his parka that day, oversized and torn at the elbows, still faintly smelling of tobacco and cedar oil. Her fingers were raw inside thin gloves, her breath came out in fog, and she didn't expect to see anything but snow and silence. But then came the sound, not a branch cracking or ice settling, but a sharp, guttural yelp that sliced through the air. Maggie stopped in her tracks, heart leaping to her throat, and turned toward the source. Out on the river, where the ice thinned near a bend, a small dog was struggling in the freezing water, its paws slapping at the edge, its eyes wild with fear. She didn't think, she just moved, as if the dog's panic had rewired her legs and heart in an instant. She dropped her thermos, kicked off her boots, and sprinted toward the riverbank, her breath burning in her lungs. The air smelled like pine and desperation, and with every step, the snow sucked at her socks like quicksand. The ice crackled as she approached the edge, the current beneath it humming with menace, waiting. The dog had stopped barking and was now whimpering, its head barely above the water, its body twitching from the cold. Maggie's body moved without permission, descending into the shallows until the shock of the freezing water stole the breath from her lungs. Her jeans clung to her legs, her muscles seized, but she kept pushing forward, arms wide, eyes locked on the dog's. "Hold on, baby," she gasped, voice choked and shaking. "I'm coming, hold on." The dog slipped again, its muzzle disappearing under the water, and a silent scream echoed through her mind. She lunged, both arms plunging into the black water, fingers searching through the icy dark until they closed on soaked, trembling fur. Her grip tightened, and for a terrifying second, she thought she might go under too, but then she planted her foot against a jagged edge of submerged ice and pulled with all the strength grief had left her. The dog came up sputtering, coughing, twisting in her arms, its body light but full of panic and survival. She backed away from the hole in the ice, dragging the animal with her, until her legs gave out and she collapsed backward into the snow. The dog curled into her instantly, pressing against her chest, its wet body convulsing in rhythm with hers. Snowflakes fell onto its head, melting against its fur, and Maggie held it tighter, her lips whispering the same words over and over. "Okay. You're okay. I've got you now." Behind her, footsteps crunched fast through the snow, voices shouting, and then the wail of a siren cut through the trees. Someone must have seen them from the nearby trail. Someone had called for help. But for a moment, there was only the sound of breathing, hers and the dog's, matching in broken rhythm. The first rescue worker dropped to her knees beside Maggie, throwing a silver thermal blanket over them both, eyes scanning the dog's limp frame. "You went in after it?" she asked, disbelief in her voice, even as her hands moved with practiced speed. Maggie nodded, unable to speak, the cold making her jaw clench and her body tremble harder. Her lips were turning blue, but her arms never loosened their hold on the dog, who now let out a faint groan, its breathing shallow but steady. The second responder gently lifted the dog into a dry towel, beginning to check its vitals while the first wrapped Maggie's hands in heat packs. "You're lucky," one of them said, "both of you." Maggie blinked, finally finding her voice, hoarse and cracked. "I couldn't just watch. Not again." The woman paused, glancing at her partner with a flicker of understanding, something in Maggie's tone cut deeper than frostbite. As they lifted her onto the stretcher, she held the dog's paw in her gloved hand, refusing to let go, even as the pain set in. Inside the ambulance, the heater blasted warm air, but the cold lingered deep in her bones, like grief. The dog was swaddled beside her, eyes closed, its chest rising and falling with tiny, exhausted effort. Maggie's fingers brushed its ear, and she realized she didn't even know if it was a he or she, didn't know its name, where it came from, who had left it. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was that something in her had cracked open the moment she heard that bark, and through it had poured a strength she hadn't felt since Jim died. The paramedic asked her a few questions, her name, her age, any medical conditions, but all Maggie could think about was the animal beside her. Is he going to make it? She asked softly. He's fighting, the medic said. So are you. Maggie nodded, eyes brimming again, and let her head rest back against the wall of the rig. She hadn't planned on being a hero that morning. She just couldn't walk away. At the hospital, they let her sit in the animal clinic's waiting area while the dog was examined. Her wet clothes had been replaced with borrowed scrubs and thick socks, her gray hair wrapped in a towel. Still, she shivered occasionally, more from the adrenaline wearing off than the cold. Through the small window in the exam room door, she could see the veterinarian working quickly, her hands steady, her face calm. Severe hypothermia, possible water in the lungs, but heart rate is holding, she'd said earlier. Maggie didn't understand all the terms, but she understood the tone, hopeful but not certain. A police officer came in to take her statement, and she told him everything, where she'd been, what she'd seen, why she jumped. He nodded, jotting things down, then looked up. Ma'am, you know you could have died, right? Maggie looked at him and said, I already was. She didn't say it for pity. She didn't say it to be dramatic. It was just the truth, delivered flat and honest, the way grief turns people quiet and plain. The officer didn't press further. He gave her a small nod, almost a salute, and left her alone again. A nurse brought her tea, and she held the cup close, letting the steam warm her face. The dog had survived the night. That's what the vet told her the next morning, after Maggie had slept sitting up in a chair outside the recovery kennel. He's stable now. Weak, but strong, willed. The vet smiled. Reminds me of someone else. Maggie smiled for the first time in weeks, something tiny unlocking inside her chest. She stood slowly, leaning against the wall for balance, and looked into the kennel. There he was, the same eyes, only now blinking at her through fogged glass, no longer panicked, just tired and watchful. The vet opened the door carefully, and the dog didn't run or bark. He stepped forward, hesitated, then pressed his head against Maggie's leg. Her breath caught again, and she lowered herself to the floor, arms wide. The dog crawled into her lap without a sound, curling up like it had always known her. A nurse asked if she had family nearby to call, but Maggie shook her head. It's just me now, she said. Then, glancing down at the dog nestled in her lap, she added, not anymore, maybe. They didn't ask if she wanted to adopt him. They saw the answer in the way her hand moved across his back, slow and certain. The vet gave her a clipboard with forms, and Maggie signed her name with a quiet sort of purpose. Outside, the sun was finally breaking through the clouds, casting golden stripes across the snow. Inside, for the first time in months, Maggie felt something warm bloom behind her ribs. As she walked out of the clinic, dog in her arms wrapped in a quilted blanket, a reporter from the local paper tried to stop her. You're the woman who jumped into the river, right, for that stray? She paused, adjusted the dog's weight, and met the reporter's eyes. He's not a stray, she said simply. Not anymore. The reporter asked for her name, and she gave it, for the first time without hesitation in months. They snapped a photo, Maggie in borrowed clothes, snow still in her hair, and the rescued dog asleep against her chest. It would go viral later, but in that moment, she didn't care. What mattered was the heartbeat under her hand, the warmth of shared survival, the flicker of something like peace. As she reached her trailer steps, the dog stirred slightly, and Maggie whispered, "Welcome home, kid." Behind her, the wind moved softly through the trees, not silent anymore, but carrying something forward. Something alive, something beginning. The trailer was quiet when they got home, too quiet. Maggie set the dog down gently on the old couch, layering to folded blankets beneath his damp body. The space smelled like old pine wood and solitude, the kind that clings to the walls. Her hands moved on instinct, gathering towels, heating a can of chicken broth, pulling out her old heating pad. She'd once nursed Jim through 3 winters of chemo in that same room, and some part of that caregiving never left her bones. The dog, now dry and dozing, opened one eye as she placed a bowl of warm broth beside him. "We'll figure it out," she said quietly, almost to herself. She didn't know what she meant, about the money, or the rules, or the future. She only knew that for the first time in months, someone needed her again. Outside, the sun dipped low over the trees, casting blue shadows across the snow-covered ground. By the next morning, the dog was alert, sitting upright, his eyes following Maggie's every movement. He hadn't barked, hadn't whined, just watched, as if studying her for signs of safety. Maggie made a soft bed on the floor near the heater and set down a bowl of softened kibble borrowed from a neighbor. She'd never seen hunger like that. The dog didn't chew, just inhaled, licking the bowl long after it was empty. When she reached to pet him, he flinched, just slightly, then allowed her touch. His ribs were sharp under her fingers, his fur patchy in places, his tail hesitant to wag. There was a scar above his right eye, half-healed, and a tear in one of his ears. Someone had hurt him, or forgotten him, or both. Maggie sat down beside him on the floor, crossing her legs slowly, letting him come to her. After a few minutes, he inched closer, pressing his body to her thigh with a low, content sigh. She closed her eyes and whispered, "You're safe now, I promise." But safety was relative. That afternoon, the local animal control officer showed up in a white pickup, knocking twice on her trailer door. Maggie stepped outside, hands folded in front of her, shielding the dog behind her legs. The officer, a tall man with kind eyes and a clipboard, introduced himself and asked if she had found the dog near the river. She nodded. He explained that technically, stray animals brought in from public rescue situations were to be reported, quarantined, and processed through the county shelter. Maggie's stomach turned. "They'll put him down?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Not if we can find the owner or a foster," the officer replied, but his tone carried the weight of too many animals, too few homes. She looked back at the dog, who was now peeking out from the screen door, tail low but eyes hopeful. "I'm not giving him up," she said firmly, surprising even herself. The officer hesitated, clearly not wanting a confrontation. "Ma'am, I can't make you, not yet, but he needs to be seen by a vet, officially, paperwork, shots, you know." Maggie nodded slowly, biting her lip. She didn't have the money for all that. Her retirement check barely covered heat and groceries. But when she looked down at the dog again, something inside her steeled. "I'll figure it out. Just give me a few days." The officer studied her for a moment, then tucked his clipboard under his arm. He said quietly, "Just keep him safe." When he drove away, Maggie stood in the cold for a long time, watching the tire tracks disappear into the snow. The dog nudged her leg with his nose, and she reached down, running her hand gently over his head. "We'll figure it out," she repeated. This time, she meant it. That evening, she rummaged through a drawer and found a small envelope marked emergency. It had $83 inside, the last bit she and Jim had kept hidden for car repairs or prescriptions. Her fingers trembled as she held the bills, thinking of the bills due next week. Then she looked at the dog, curled up in Jim's old flannel jacket on the couch, breathing slow and steady. She called the clinic that had treated him after the rescue and asked if they took payment plans. The receptionist remembered her. "The River Lady," she said with a smile in her voice. They agreed to a follow-up check the next day, minimal cost. Maggie hung up the phone and stared out the window into the falling night. Snow drifted silently past the glass, soft and endless. "You better not die on me now," she whispered. The dog lifted his head, eyes locked on hers, like he understood. At the vet the next morning, the dog was surprisingly calm in her arms, even with the buzz of fluorescent lights and distant barks. The technician took his temperature, checked his lungs, and gently cleaned a cracked paw pad. "He's underweight, but strong," the vet said. "Might have been out there for weeks, maybe months." They scanned for a microchip, nothing. No collar, no tag, no record. Legally, he was nobody's. "Any idea what you'll call him?" the vet asked, scribbling notes on the chart. Maggie looked down at the dog, who was watching her every move. "Hank," she said softly. "That was Jim's middle name." The vet smiled. "Fitting, he's a survivor." They gave her a bag of donated food samples, a few pain meds, and a small blanket from the clinic's donation bin. As they left, Maggie pressed her cheek to Hank's fur. "You're not nobody anymore." When they got home, Maggie made a small sign and taped it to her trailer door. "Please do not knock." Nervous dog inside. She wasn't sure if it was true or just an excuse to keep the world at bay. Hank explored the trailer carefully, sniffing every corner, finally settling at the foot of the couch with a heavy thump. Maggie sat nearby with a notebook and a calculator, trying to rework her budget. She could cancel cable, use less propane, eat more canned beans. It would be tight, but maybe manageable. As she worked, she felt eyes on her. Hank was watching, head tilted. She reached out a hand, and this time, he came quickly, resting his chin on her knee. She didn't cry, not yet, but something in her chest softened, like a knot loosening after months of being pulled too tight. For the first time since Jim's funeral, she felt like life might not be over. The next few days blurred into a rhythm, slow, tender, uncertain. Maggie and Hank went on short walks, bundled against the cold, staying close to the river's edge. Hank's tail started wagging, tentatively at first, then full-bodied, like he was remembering how to be a dog again. She brushed him each morning, careful around the scarred parts, whispering encouragement as tufts of fur came loose. At night, he refused to sleep unless his body touched hers, sometimes just a paw on her calf, sometimes curled tightly against her back. She let him. The nightmares that had haunted her since Jim's death grew less frequent, replaced by the warm weight of a living soul beside her. The silence in the trailer changed, too, not gone, but filled with breathing, movement, the occasional thump of a tail. Maggie caught herself humming again, but not everyone in the small town was thrilled. A neighbor, the same one who'd lent her dog food, warned her that animal control might come back, this time with forms, maybe even a fine. "You can't just take in strays," she said, "even if you saved it." Maggie nodded, biting her lip, then glanced at Hank snoozing in the sunbeam by the window. "I didn't save him," she said. "He saved me." The neighbor didn't argue, but the whirring hung in the air. That night, Maggie sat at her tiny kitchen table with Hank at her feet, writing a letter to the local shelter. She explained everything, the river, the rescue, the bond. "I don't know the rules," she wrote, "but I know what's right. And I think that should count for something." She mailed it the next day, not expecting a reply, just needing the truth to exist somewhere on paper. A week after the rescue, a truck pulled into her driveway again, animal control. Maggie's stomach twisted as she opened the door, Hank behind her, ears back but not barking. It wasn't the same officer. This one was younger, clipboard in hand, expression unreadable. "Miss Lowell?" he asked. "We got your letter." She held her breath, nodding. The man looked down at Hank, then back at her. "We don't usually make exceptions, but this isn't usual." He handed her a stack of forms. "You want to make it official." Maggie blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" The man smiled. "For the first time, adoption. Paperwork's ready, if you still want him." Her hands trembled as she took the clipboard. Hank nudged her calf gently, and she looked down into his waiting eyes. She whispered, "I want him," then louder, "He's already mine." The adoption papers sat on Maggie's kitchen table like a trophy, creased at the corners from how many times she had opened and closed them. Her name was printed beside Hank's in bold black ink, official, final, no loopholes. He had a name now, a home, a person. Maggie looked at the document again that evening while Hank gnawed on a soft toy from the clinic's donation bin. Her fingers lingered on the line that read Omer. It felt surreal. She'd spent months unable to own anything, not even her grief, and now here she was, responsible for a life again. Outside, the river glinted with the first light of spring melt. Inside, the space felt fuller, not just with sound but with meaning. There was movement in the air again, the subtle rhythm of recovery. When Hank lay beside her that night, his paw on her arm, she whispered, "Thank you for choosing to stay." Word of her rescue had already spread through the small town, but it wasn't until the local newspaper ran the story that things really changed. The front page showed Maggie holding Hank wrapped in a worn red blanket, both of them gazing into the camera with matching eyes, weary, alert, alive. "Widow jumps into icy river to save drowning dog," the headline read. Beneath it, the story of her bravery, her loss, and her quiet defiance of the rules. At first, she felt embarrassed. People waved at her in the grocery store. A stranger left a bag of dog food on her trailer steps. But gradually, the shame gave way to something else, a sense of belonging. They weren't pointing at her because she was broken. They were seeing her because she mattered again. And Hank, beside her, seemed to walk a little taller, tail higher, steps steadier. The vet clinic called a few days later and asked if they could feature Hank's recovery on their bulletin board. "He's our miracle case," the receptionist said. Maggie agreed, and they returned for a follow-up photo. Hank had gained weight, his coat growing thicker, the light back in his eyes. "Whatever you're doing," the vet smiled, "keep doing it." She mentioned that the clinic sometimes needed volunteers, just an hour or two a week, to sit with recovering animals. "Sometimes they just need quiet company," she said. Maggie hesitated, unsure if she had anything left to give anyone but Hank. But when she looked down at him, watching another dog through the window of the waiting room, she felt something rise in her. "I'll try," she said. "I've got time." It was a lie. She didn't have time. She had purpose now. Volunteering at the clinic became their new routine. Twice a week, Maggie and Hank would walk the short mile down the road and spend quiet hours in the recovery wing. Maggie sat beside cages, offering whispered words and gentle hands. Hank would lie on a blanket nearby, sometimes approaching the more nervous dogs, his calm presence easing their trembles. It was like he understood, he remembered. The staff began to call him the therapy dog without a badge. Maggie didn't correct them. She just smiled and watched him work, amazed at how much healing could pass silently between animals. People began asking about Hank's story, and Maggie found herself telling it, not as a tragedy, but as a turning point. "He didn't just survive the river," she would say. "He crossed into something better, and he dragged me with him." One afternoon, as Maggie folded laundry on her trailer porch, a familiar car pulled into the driveway. It was the first officer, the one who had come after the rescue, clipboard in hand. He stepped out slowly, offering a wave. "Heard you two became local celebrities," he said, smiling. "Not quite," Maggie replied, patting Hank's head. "We just stopped hiding." The officer knelt to pet Hank, who licked his hand with cautious approval. "There's a program we're trying to get off the ground," he said. "Companions for seniors. Sheltered dogs placed with folks who need a reason to wake up in the morning." Maggie raised an eyebrow. "Sounds familiar." He nodded. "Thought maybe you'd speak about your experience. Nothing formal. Just tell your truth." She hesitated, then looked at Hank. His gaze was steady. "All right," she said. "If it helps someone find their Hank, I'll do it." The library room was small, but filled with faces, many gray-haired, many alone. Maggie stood in front of them, hands clasped, voice shaking at first. She told them about the river, about the moment she ran barefoot into ice without thinking, about the months after Jim died, when even getting out of bed felt like betrayal. But mostly, she talked about Hank, about how he came into her life not as a responsibility, but as a rescue for them both. "I didn't need a dog," she said. "I needed a reason. And he gave it to me." The room was silent, a few people wiping tears. One man in the back raised his hand. "Do you think we all have a Hank out there?" Maggie smiled, her eyes misting. "I think they find us," she said. "When we stop pretending we don't need to be found." The speech became the first of several. Maggie was invited to speak at senior centers, schools, even a local radio show. Each time, she brought Hank with her, and each time, people responded not to the heroism, but to the honesty. She never pretended she was brave. She only told them the truth, that she was broken, and he was too, and somehow they fit the cracks inside each other. People began writing letters, telling her their own stories, of loss, of pets, of redemption. Maggie kept them in a box by the couch, rereading them on quiet evenings with Hank curled against her legs. They weren't alone, those people, and neither was she anymore. The story that began on a frozen river had rippled outward, like light under melting ice, warming places she never thought could thaw. Then came the moment that truly shifted everything. Maggie returned home one morning to find a box on her doorstep. Inside was a note, for Hank, who reminded us what rescue really means. Beneath it, a check, $5,000, anonymous donation, enough to cover vet bills, propane, food, and then some. Maggie sat down on the steps, tears rolling freely. It wasn't about the money, it was the message. That someone out there had seen the quiet work they were doing, the slow mending of lives, that it mattered. Hank came over and rested his chin on her knee, watching her with those same deep, still eyes. "Looks like you're officially employed," she whispered. Hope you're unionized. With the donation, Maggie set up a small fund in town, Hank's Second Chance Fund. Its purpose? To help other senior citizens adopt and care for rescue animals without worrying about initial costs. The vet clinic partnered immediately, so did the animal control department. What started as a name on a form became a movement. Flyers went up, Hank's face became the mascot. Maggie, once invisible in the supermarket aisle, now walked with purpose and was greeted by name. People waved from porches, some brought treats for Hank, others asked for help finding their own rescue dog. Maggie helped where she could, sometimes with words, sometimes just by listening. One day, while volunteering at the clinic, a young dog came in, malnourished, fearful, full of scars. Maggie sat beside its cage quietly, letting it get used to her presence. Hank lay on the floor nearby, his eyes never leaving the newcomer. Slowly, the dog crept closer to the bars, and then, over the course of an hour, rested its nose against Hank's paw through the metal slats. Maggie watched, her heart full. The vet passed by and whispered, "Looks like Hank's training his replacement." Maggie chuckled softly, brushing a tear from her cheek. "He's not going anywhere," she said, "but maybe we've got more work to do." And that night, she added another line to her calendar, "Visit Rusty every Tuesday." Because healing had become a habit, Maggie and Hank weren't just a story anymore, they were a symbol. Not of dramatic rescues or viral fame, but of quiet endurance, of choosing to stay, of finding meaning in the most unlikely moments, a frozen river, a broken dog, an empty trailer full of silence. Now, that silence was filled with life, the shuffle of paws, the clink of food bowls, the hum of purpose returning. Maggie no longer counted the days since Jim died. She counted walks, moments, new beginnings. And each one was shared. One woman, one dog, one leap into freezing water, and everything changed. Maggie's days no longer began in silence. Each morning, just before sunrise, Hank would nudge her shoulder with his nose, tail thumping softly against the couch. She'd open her eyes to find him already watching her, as if to say, "We made it through another night." They didn't rush anymore. Their mornings were slow, a pot of oatmeal shared at the table, a short walk to the river's edge, the same bench Jim used to sit on. Maggie talked aloud during those walks now, not to herself, to Hank. She told him stories from the past, small things, how Jim proposed with a plastic ring, how she once burned a whole Thanksgiving dinner. Hank would listen without interrupting, his ears twitching when her voice trembled. He was the best kind of listener, one who never judged, never walked away. Their trailer had changed, too. Where there had once been stacks of unopened mail and half-packed boxes, now there were blankets on every surface, dog toys underfoot, and photos taped to the fridge. Maggie had started taking pictures again, mostly of Hank, him running through snow, him sleeping upside down, him sitting like a king on Jim's old recliner. She printed the best ones and gave them away at the clinic, to patients and staff alike. "Take one," she'd say, "he's good luck." People smiled when they saw him now. Hank had a presence, steady, gentle, reassuring. Even the mailman started carrying a biscuit in his pocket, tossing it to Hank with a nod. It wasn't a grand life, but it was whole. And in its quiet rhythm, Maggie found a peace she never expected to feel again. Every Thursday, Maggie hosted a gathering she called Coffee and Companions, an open, your morning for seniors and their rescue pets. What began with 3 folding chairs and instant coffee grew into a standing event, held in the community hall with the help of local volunteers. People brought in dogs, cats, even a parrot named Lucy who sang opera when happy. Maggie would sit at the front, Hank at her feet, and open with a story. Not dramatic ones, just little moments that reminded everyone why they were there. "This morning," she said once, Hank barked at a squirrel, then tripped over a pinnacone, and I laughed so hard, I spilled my tea. That's what joy looks like now, sloppy and unexpected. The room always laughed, and cried, and thanked her for reminding them that healing doesn't have to be loud. One afternoon, as Maggie cleaned up after one of the meetings, a woman approached her with red, rimmed eyes. She introduced herself as Claire and held out a photo of a black terrier. "This was Max," she said. "I lost him a year ago. I haven't been able to touch another dog since." Maggie took the photo gently, nodding, waiting. But today, watching Hank, I felt something loosen. Maybe it's time again. Maggie smiled, her voice low. There's no rush. But when you're ready, I'll come with you. We'll find your next love. Claire exhaled deeply, nodding. I'd like that. Maggie watched her walk away, the photo clutched in her hand, and felt that familiar warmth rise in her chest. It was happening again, the ripple effect. Hank hadn't just changed her life, he was helping others change theirs. Hank became more than a pet, he was a partner. When Maggie volunteered at the clinic, he waited patiently beside the treatment tables. When she ran support groups at the community hall, he lay beside grieving widows and widowers, offering quiet companionship. When someone cried, Hank moved closer. When someone laughed, his tail wagged. He had no certifications, no formal training, but people called him a healer. And Maggie didn't correct them. In her heart, she knew they were right. He'd been broken once, too, shivering beneath river ice, nearly invisible. But he survived, and in surviving, he became something more. A bridge between pain and recovery. A reminder that second chances weren't just possible, they were necessary. Maggie kept a journal now, not for her grief, but for gratitude. Each night, she wrote one moment that had mattered. Today, Hank sat beside a woman who hadn't spoken in 2 weeks. Today, I felt Jim in the sun. Today, I woke up without dread. The entries were short, sometimes messy, always honest. She kept the journal on her nightstand, and sometimes she'd read passages aloud to Hank. You're in every one of these, she told him. You're the reason they exist. He'd lift his head, blink at her, then rest it again. That was Hank's way. Never showy, just steady, present, alive. In early spring, Maggie received a letter from the Regional Humane Society. They wanted to feature her and Hank in their annual campaign to raise awareness about senior pet adoptions. Maggie hesitated at first. She didn't like cameras. She didn't like talking about herself. But then she remembered all the people who had come to her over the past few months. Claire, the vet tech, the librarian who adopted a 3-legged cat. They had all found something through her story, through Hank's journey, so she agreed. The photographer came on a rainy morning, and the photos were simple, Maggie pouring tea while Hank sat at her feet, both of them framed by the window and the soft gray light. One photo, in particular, stood out, Hank resting his head on Maggie's lap, eyes closed. The caption they chose read, "He didn't just rescue a dog. He rescued hope." The campaign went statewide. Donations poured in, adoptions increased. Clinics started companions' corners for lonely seniors and struggling pets. Maggie's phone rang often now, shelters, journalists, even high school students doing projects. She didn't say yes to everything, but she always answered, because every call was a chance to remind someone that brokenness wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something brave, something new. The river didn't take me, she told one reporter. It returned me, I just had to be willing to jump. Hank sat beside her the whole time, ears perked. When the reporter asked for a final quote, Maggie said, "He didn't just save a dog, he saved what was left of me." Her world was still small, a trailer near a river, a dog, a calendar of volunteer shifts. But it was full in ways she never thought possible. People dropped by unannounced with coffee and dog treats. Children waved when they passed her on walks. Jim's old fishing buddy stopped by once and cried when he met Hank. "He'd be proud of you," he said. Maggie just smiled and looked at the river. "I think he sent him," she whispered. "That's the kind of thing Jim would do." That night, she lit a candle on the porch, the way she used to on their anniversary. But this time, she wasn't alone. Hank curled beside her, warm and steady, as the flame flickered gently in the wind. Spring turned to summer, and the river swelled with melted snow. Maggie and Hank still walked the path each morning, pausing at the bend where the ice had once broken. She didn't look away from it anymore. She faced it, honored it. That place had taken her to the edge, and then handed her back a reason to live. People who passed them on the trail would nod or smile, sometimes stopping to ask, "Is this the dog from the story?" And Maggie would grin, scratch Hank behind the ears, and say, "No, this is the story." Because the story wasn't about the river or the rescue or the press. It was about what came after. About how life, once shattered, could knit itself back together through simple love. The porch became their sanctuary in the evenings. Maggie would sit in her old rocking chair, sipping chamomile tea, Hank at her feet. The sunset painted the sky in strokes of gold and purple, and the crickets sang lullabies to the quiet earth. Sometimes she read aloud, books, letters, journal entries. Other times, she just sat in the hush of belonging. "We're okay now," she'd whisper, and Hank would blink in slow agreement. The ache in her chest never fully left. Grief doesn't vanish. But it softened, made room for other feelings, hope, joy, purpose, things she thought she'd buried with Jim now blooming again, fragile but fierce. One evening, a little girl from down the road brought Maggie a drawing, crayons on folded paper. It showed a stick, figure woman and a dog with a big heart over its head. The words scrawled at the bottom said, "Thank you for saving the dog and yourself." Maggie hung it on the fridge beside Hank's adoption paper. It was crooked, colorful, perfect. She stared at it for a long time, fingers resting on Hank's collar. "We're leaving something behind," she said. "Something good." He didn't reply, of course. But when he rested his chin on her foot, she knew he understood. They were no longer survivors. They were a team, a mission, a promise to the world that broken things still shine. Maggie often found herself standing at the window in the early morning, tea in hand, watching the fog rise off the river like a ghost slipping away. It was always quiet then, the kind of quiet that didn't feel lonely anymore, but sacred. Behind her, Hank would stretch and yawn, his collar jingling softly, the signal that it was time to start the day. He didn't move much faster these days, his steps were more deliberate, his naps longer. But Maggie knew every shift in his breath, every change in his mood. He was older now, and so was she, but the weight of years no longer felt heavy. It felt full, lived, worth something, and that river, once a place of loss, had become a reminder of how far they had come. How close she had been to disappearing, and how deeply she had returned. The world hadn't changed overnight. Maggie still lived in a modest trailer. Her social security check still came on the second Wednesday of every month. But her heart no longer clenched when the silence came. She had Hank's breathing, the rhythm of their days, and the echo of laughter she thought she'd never hear again. On some nights, she'd sit on the porch, look up at the stars, and talk to Jim like he was sitting beside her. "You were right," she'd say, "I did need someone. I just didn't know it'd have 4 legs and a crooked ear." She could imagine Jim laughing at that, shaking his head, and saying something like, "You always did fall for strays." Hank would sit beside her, his body warm against her leg, as if he heard the conversation too, and approved. Over time, the community began to refer to Maggie's story not by her name, but by what it meant. "That river story," they'd say, or "the woman who saved herself by saving him." It had become a touchstone for people wrestling with their own grief, their own reasons to keep going. The little library, where she gave her first talk, now had a shelf dedicated to animal rescue stories, and a framed photo of Hank sat beside the checkout desk. Every year, on the anniversary of the rescue, the town hosted a second chance day. Seniors and shelter animals would gather in the park. There were booths, blankets, biscuits, and a gentle speech from Maggie, who always ended by saying, "If you're still breathing, you're still becoming." One afternoon, Maggie received a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single photo, a middle-aged man holding a newly adopted husky, both smiling in front of a shelter banner. On the back, it said, "You helped me choose life. Thank you." Maggie held the photo to her chest, eyes closed, as tears warmed her cheeks. She didn't know the man's name. She didn't need to. What mattered was that somewhere out there, another soul had jumped into their own metaphorical river and surfaced. It reminded her that pain never ends a story. It begins a new chapter. One where light creeps back through the cracks. One where love returns, in fur or in words or in breathless, trembling hope. The vet called one spring morning to tell her that Rusty, the nervous pup Hank had comforted months ago, had been adopted by an elderly man who had recently lost his wife. He asked if we knew anyone who believed in second chances. The vet said, laughing gently, "So we told him about you and Hank." Maggie smiled, tears already rising. "Then he's in good company," she said. Hank was lying at her feet as she spoke, thumping his tail. He always seemed to know when a win had happened. Maggie knelt beside him and whispered, "Another heart saved, buddy. You're still doing your work. Hank licked her wrist, then curled back into sleep. Even resting, he was a quiet force, like grief had been, but softer now. Kinder. Maggie didn't fear the future anymore. She didn't count down her days or dread waking up. She still missed Jim, that never went away. But now his memory lived beside Hank's presence, not in conflict, but in harmony. The pain and the peace shared the same space, teaching her that we are never only one thing, not just broken, not just brave. One morning, she caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror and was startled to see herself smiling without realizing it. Not forced, not polite, just present. She leaned closer and said softly, "You're still here." And that's enough. Behind her, Hank barked at a squirrel outside. She laughed. Not the kind of laugh that masks pain, but the kind that rises from somewhere deep and true. Near the river, there's a bench with a plaque now. The community put it up without telling her. It reads, "In honor of those who leap into the cold for love and find themselves on the other side." Maggie visits it often, sitting with Hank as the water flows past. Sometimes people join her, strangers who sit quietly, not needing to speak. She always welcomes them with a nod. Because some grief doesn't need words, some healing happens just by being seen. And when they do speak, it's usually soft. "Is this the bench?" they ask. Maggie just says, "It is." And they know what she means. Not every river needs to be crossed. Some just need to be sat beside, together. In her final letter to the Shelter Fund board, Maggie wrote, "I won't always be here. But Hank's story will be. And if it keeps one person from giving up, then it was worth everything." The board had it engraved on a small metal sign next to the donation box. Visitors would stop to read it, then pet Hank if he was there. Children sometimes drew pictures of them, Maggie with her cane, Hank in a little superhero cape someone had gifted him. She kept the drawings in a drawer, each one a reminder that her story had echoed beyond its beginning. That the moment she jumped into the river wasn't the end, it was the beginning of a new voice, a shared voice. Years passed, but some things remained unchanged. The river kept flowing, the seasons kept shifting. And Maggie and Hank, though slower, never stopped walking the same trail together. They didn't need to talk much anymore. Their silences were rich with meaning. Every glance between them carried whole sentences. Every step was a vow to keep showing up for life, one day at a time. And as the world grew louder and faster around them, their quiet became a kind of sanctuary, not just for them, but for everyone who knew their story. People didn't come to Maggie for advice. They came to be reminded that hope didn't always roar. Sometimes it wagged its tail. One evening, as the sun dipped below the pine trees and cast golden ribbons across the trailer windows, Maggie leaned back in her rocking chair. Hank nestled at her feet. She looked down at him, her heart so full it ached. "We made a life, didn't we?" she said. He blinked slowly, tail brushing the floor. "You found me when I didn't even know I was missing." Her voice trembled, but she didn't cry, not this time. She had run out of tears, or maybe she had finally run into peace. Behind them, a wind chime whispered its soft song, and somewhere in the trees, a bird called out into the evening hush. Not long after, the vet mailed her a framed version of the clinic photo that had started it all, the one with Maggie and Hank by the window, eyes closed, the world moving quietly around them. It arrived with a note, "You taught us that healing isn't about fixing what's broken, it's about loving through it." Maggie placed it above her table, where the morning light touched it first. Each time she looked at it, she didn't see a woman and a dog. She saw a promise. A moment when fear was swallowed by instinct, when pain gave way to love. When the cold stopped being the end and became the path. In town, they still tell the story, the woman who jumped into the river. But the ending changes now, depending on who's telling it. Some say it was about bravery, others say it was about grief. But Maggie knows what it was really about. It was about choosing life, even when life felt like a stranger. It was about showing up for something, or someone, when all you wanted was to disappear. And in doing so, being shown that you still mattered. That your heart could still find its way through ice and sorrow. In the quietest moments, when no one is watching, Maggie sometimes whispers thank you to the sky. For Jim, for Hank, for the river that gave her back to herself. Because not everyone gets a second chance. And even fewer get to share it, but she did. And she shared it fully, with teeth and truth and warmth and ache. So now, When you walk the river path and see the bench, maybe you'll pause. Maybe you'll sit. Maybe you'll remember her story or see a part of your own in it. And, just maybe, you'll ask yourself the question she lived into every day. If you heard crying in the freezing woods, would you run toward it? Because sometimes, the thing we're saving is ourselves.